Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
On August 12, 2016, a survey drone operator working in a remote sector of the Idaho mountains, known as the Devil's Throat, noticed a disturbing anomaly on his monitor screen. In the dense crown of an ancient yellow pine tree, 50 feet off the ground, hung a shapeless object that resembled a giant cocoon. It was entangled in slings that had grown into the bark of the tree and was partially covered by a dirty white cloth that fluttered in the wind. As the drone approached, the camera captured a detail that prompted the surveyors to immediately call the rangers: a human hiking boot sticking out of the bottom of the cocoon. The forest, which had been silent for exactly 2 years, finally decided to give up its worst secret about the fate of Steven Maxwell. What was found in the crown of the tree was not a baseball jumper's accident, but an execution scene so grotesque that even experienced Custer County detectives refused to believe their own eyes. The story of this fateful disappearance begins on October 14, 2014, in the small town of Stanley, Idaho. This settlement, sandwiched between high mountain peaks, is called the Gateway to the Wilderness by the locals. It is from here that the routes leading to the heart of the Sawtooth Range begin, a place where the beauty of the scenery borders on mortal danger for unprepared loners. However, 26-year-old Steven Maxwell was no novice or arrogant amateur. In the local community of hunters and guides, he was known as a man of phenomenal, almost military discipline. A former Army Ranger, he was used to calculating every step, and his preparations for hiking resembled the planning of tactical special operations. That morning, Steven was preparing for his most ambitious solo hike yet. His goal was to hunt wapiti for 3 days in the high-altitude Sawtooth Lake area. It is an area with jagged granite peaks cutting through the sky and dense coniferous forests where it is easy to lose your bearings. Maxwell has never taken a chance in vain. His backpack, in addition to the standard equipment, always contained a satellite beacon, an advanced first aid kit, and a supply of provisions in case of emergency. At 5:30 in the morning, the outdoor surveillance cameras of the private outfitter's shop, Peak Supply, captured Steven's black pickup truck. The vehicle was moving slowly down the main street, heading toward the town's exit, toward the start of the Iron Creek hiking trail. The black and white footage shows the car's headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, with only the driver sitting in the cab. This was the last time Steven Maxwell was seen within the confines of civilization. Upon arrival, Steven acted according to his plan. At 7:15 in the morning, he activated his phone for the last time to send a text message to his fiancée, Sarah. The text was concise and clear, just like Steven himself. "Here. The weather is perfect. I'll be in touch in 48 hours. Immediately after sending the message, his phone disconnected from the cellular network. For this area, surrounded by granite walls of mountains, this was a completely normal phenomenon, and at the time, no one paid any attention to it. The alarm was raised only on the evening of October 17th. The agreed 48 hours had passed, plus the time limit for returning to the car, but Steven never got in touch. Sarah, knowing her fiancé's punctuality, realized that something serious had happened. She immediately called the Custer County Sheriff's Office. The officer on duty took the report, and the search and rescue mechanism was set in motion. The search began at dawn on October 18th. The scale of the operation amazed even experienced rescuers. Over the next 2 weeks, more than 200 volunteers, professional search teams, canine teams, and National Guard helicopters combed every square yard of the Iron Creek area and Alpine Way Trail. The forest was filled with people's voices, dogs barking, and the sound of propellers, but the mountains were silent. In the first days of the operation, the rescuers encountered the first unexplained detail. Specially trained search dogs picked up Steven's trail near his car in the parking lot. They confidently led the group about 3 miles deep into the forest, following a clear route that the hunter had presumably planned. But then, at a small rocky outcropping, the dogs suddenly stopped. They circled in place, whining, and unable to find a continuation of the scent. The trail did not lead to the right, left, or back. It simply broke off, as if Steven Maxwell had evaporated into thin air or been instantly lifted off the ground at that point. There were no signs of struggle, blood, or dragging of the body on the stony ground. The situation became critical on the 5th day of the search. Nature, as if conspiring against people, struck. An early and unexpectedly powerful snowstorm began. In one day, the mountains were covered with 20 inches of snow. Visibility dropped to 0, and the temperature plummeted. It became impossible to continue the ground operation. The snow safely hid under its thickness any potential evidence that the volunteers might have missed in the early days. 2 weeks later, the active phase of the search was officially over. The case was closed with the standard wording for such cases: missing person, presumed dead from hypothermia or predator attack. At a press conference, the sheriff of Custer County expressed his condolences to the family and noted that even professionals are not immune to fatal mistakes in such wild conditions. But Steven's parents, his fiancée, and local rangers who knew Maxwell personally refused to accept this version. A pro like him couldn't just disappear without leaving a trace. He had survival gear, weapons, and the knowledge of how to behave when faced with a bear or cougar. He knew how to build a shelter from the weather. The absence of his body, equipment, or even a piece of clothing did not fit the logic of the accident. The snow covered the Sawtooth range with a white blanket of silence. But it was a deceptive silence. In the sheriff's office archives, Maxwell's case file was placed on the unsolved crimes shelf. But one of the detectives noticed a strange detail in the description of the last hours before the storm. A volunteer claimed to have heard a sound in a remote gorge that was uncharacteristic of wildlife: the hum of a rapidly moving engine. Almost 2 years have passed since the gloomy October day when Steven Maxwell was last seen alive. During this time, his case has moved from the category of active investigations to the category of so-called cold cases, or, as detectives say, grouse. The folder with the materials was gathering dust in the archive, and only his family and closest friends remembered the name of the missing hunter. The summer of 2016 was abnormally hot, even for the harsh climate of Idaho. The scorching sun melted the snowcaps on the peaks that usually stayed on year-round, exposing slopes that had been hidden under ice for decades. Rivers became shallow, and dense forests became more passable, allowing people to reach places that had previously been considered inaccessible. On August 12, 2016, a group of surveyors from the private company Idaho Timber Survey was conducting a routine aerial survey of the forests. Their target was a hard-to-reach sector located 8 miles from the Iron Creek hiking trail. This area, cut by deep ravines and littered with debris, was known locally as the Devil's Throat. Due to the steep slopes and impenetrable thickets, tourists almost never came here, and even experienced rangers tried to avoid the area. The surveyors used professional drones to draw up a detailed elevation map and assess the condition of the forest. The work went according to plan until the drone operator noticed a strange anomaly on the monitor screen. Among the continuous green carpet of pine needles, in the crown of one of the centuries-old yellow pines, an unnatural white spot was visible. At first, it was mistaken for a stuck weather balloon or wind-blown debris. The cameraman pointed the camera closer to examine the object. When the camera came into focus, the man recoiled from the screen. The image transmitted by the drone made the blood run cold in the veins of the entire team. At a height of about 50 feet, which is 15 meters, a massive, shapeless object was hanging in a branch of thick branches. It resembled a giant cocoon, tightly entangled with slings that had already grown into the bark of the tree in some places. The dirty white fabric, darkened by time, rain, and wind, hid its contents. But one detail left no doubt about the nature of the find. A human trekking boot was sticking out of the bottom of the cocoon, hanging freely above the abyss. The group immediately contacted the rangers. The report of a body found at such a high altitude and in such a remote location sounded so incredible that at first it was received with disbelief. However, the drone video dispelled all doubts. An investigative team and a rescue team were immediately dispatched to the site. However, when they got to the foot of the tree, they realized that it was impossible to remove the body using conventional means. The giant pine tree, known as a ponderosa, had a smooth trunk with no lower branches, and the body itself was hanging at a dangerous height in the dense crown. A specialized team of arborists had to be called in. The operation to raise and lower the body turned into a real challenge that lasted more than 6 hours. The climbers, risking their lives, carefully climbed up, securing the safety cables. Every move had to be deliberate, because any mistake could lead to the fall of the fragile remains or injury to the rescuers themselves. When the cocoon was finally freed from the branches and lowered to the ground, the people below plunged into an oppressive silence. Only the sound of the wind in the pine trees broke the dead silence of the devil's throat. Examination of the find on the ground confirmed the worst guesses. Inside the cocoon were almost completely skeletonized human remains. The clothes, despite the impact of the elements, were well enough preserved to recognize the brand. It was an expensive hunting camouflage made by the company Grid of Mountains. This was the outfit that Steven Maxwell preferred. But what raised the most questions was what the body was wrapped in. It was not an ordinary tourist tent or sleeping bag. The remains were tangled in the slings and fabric of an old, faded parachute. The experts who arrived at the scene immediately noted the archaic nature of the equipment. It was not a modern sports dome, but a massive cargo parachute from the Vietnam War, designed to land heavy equipment or supplies. The fabric was rough, the seams were industrial. The body literally merged with this parachute, forming a single whole that had been swinging over the forest for 2 years, hidden from people's eyes by thick branches. The identification procedure did not take long. The dental records provided by the parents of the boy who disappeared 2 years ago matched the jaw structure of the found remains. The official conclusion was unequivocal. The body belonged to Steven Maxwell. The news that the missing hunter had been found in a tree crown, tangled in a parachute, instantly spread across the state and caused a real shock among the public. The press immediately picked up the most obvious version. Journalists began to write about how Steven may have led a double life and was secretly fond of base jumping or illegal airplane jumping. According to this theory, the tragedy was caused by a failed jump. The parachute was blown by the wind into a remote area where it caught on a tree, and the guy died without being able to descend or call for help. This version seemed logical to outside observers, as it explained both the location of the body and the presence of the parachute. However, the family of the deceased categorically rejected such assumptions. Steven's parents and fiancé claimed that he had never been interested in parachuting. Moreover, the family knew a detail that destroyed the journalist's coherent theory. Steven was terrified of heights. He was a man of the land, the forest, and mountain trails, but he never aspired to the sky. The idea of him voluntarily jumping out of an airplane or off a cliff seemed absurd to them. The situation was becoming more and more confusing. If Steven hadn't jumped, how did he end up 50 feet up in a cargo chute in the middle of an impenetrable forest? Why did an experienced hunter who was planning a hiking trip suddenly become a plane crash victim? A detailed examination of the body in the morgue was to provide answers to these questions. When the pathologist began to cut through the decayed tissue of the parachute to free the bones, he noticed a strange discrepancy in the way the body was attached to the slings. The knots were tied in a way that only another person could have done. Friends, before we continue to dive into the details of this gruesome investigation, I have one important thing to ask of you. Please subscribe to the channel, click on the bell, and leave any comment below this video. It only takes a few seconds, but it is critically important for YouTube's algorithms. Your activity will help to promote this video to recommendations, and our story will be seen by as many people as possible. Together, we are creating a community that cares about the truth. Thank you for your support, and now let's move on to the sterile forensic rooms. In September of 2016, the coroner's office in Boise, Idaho, was a depressing silence. What began as an accident victim identification procedure was rapidly turning into the solving of one of the most complex crimes in the state's history. The chief pathologist, along with Custer County detectives, was preparing to demolish a press-friendly theory about a base jumping gone awry. And the first piece of evidence lying on the stainless steel table was the very cocoon. Experts from the Air Force, who were urgently called in for consultation, conducted a detailed examination of the dirty cloth. Their verdict was categorical and left no room for doubt. The object found was a decommissioned G-12 cargo dome. This specific military equipment was designed exclusively for airdropping heavy boxes of ammunition, medicine, or provisions into combat zones. The design of this parachute lacked a critical part, a suspension system for a person. It was just a piece of industrial textile, a piece of equipment that had never been used for human jumps. But the worst was revealed when the experts began to disassemble the components. Steven's body was not just tangled in the slings, it was carefully and methodically tied to them. The killer did not use specialized carabiners, but rough, industrial plastic ties and pieces of ordinary climbing rope. The nature of the fixation testified to the victim's complete helplessness at the time of tying. Experts concluded that Steven was attached to the parachute after the onset of biological death, or when he was in a state of deep, irreversible unconsciousness. It was cold-blooded cargo packing, not preparation for a jump. The next step was to analyze the bone injuries, which finally buried the fall from a height theory. If Steven had fallen from 50 feet or hit a tree trunk during an uncontrolled descent, his skeleton would have had characteristic compression fractures of the spine or limbs. Instead, the X-rays showed a completely different picture. The man's ribs were broken exclusively on the right side, and his kneecap was crushed as if it had been hit with a heavy object. These were injuries sustained on the ground as a result of brutal physical violence. However, the final point in this gruesome puzzle was put by a chest scan. Deep inside, stuck between a rib and a spine, a foreign object lit up on the monitor screen with a metallic sheen. The surgeon carefully removed the sharp, triangular tip from the tissue. It was not a fragment of a branch or a bullet. It was the tip of a powerful hunting crossbow bolt. The pathologist's conclusion sounded like thunder in the silence of the morgue. Steven Maxwell was killed on the ground. Someone had shot him with a crossbow, inflicting a fatal wound, and then realized a plan that was devilish in its ingenuity. The killer used a cargo parachute to stage an airborne death, or simply to hide the body safely. He lifted the victim into the air and left him where he was not wanted. The criminal knew that the search dogs were working on the trail on the ground, and the volunteers were looking at their feet for fear of tripping. The sky among the thick pine needles was the perfect hiding place. The case was immediately reclassified as aggravated first-degree murder. Detective Michael Harris now realized that he was not up against the forces of nature, but a cunning and cruel mind. He needed to find someone who had access to rare, decommissioned military equipment. And the first clue came when investigators paid attention to the specifics of the parachute itself. Such a thing cannot be bought in a supermarket. It always leaves a paper trail. In October 2016, the investigation into the murder of Steven Maxwell moved from sterile forensic laboratories to dusty archives and airfield hangars. Detective Michael Harris, who headed the investigation team, clearly understood that the key to unraveling the killer's identity was not in the forest, but in the sky. The found G-12 cargo parachute was the only clue that could lead to the criminal. It was a specific, rare piece of equipment that could not be bought in a regular tourist shop or accidentally found at a garage sale. Possession of such equipment required not only specific knowledge, but also the appropriate equipment to use it. An airplane was needed to lift the body of an adult man into the air and drop it the way it was done. The task force outlined a search circle with a radius of 100 miles from where the body was found. In this region of Idaho, where roads often end in dead ends, small aircraft are not a luxury, but a necessity. Investigators began methodically checking all owners of private jets and pilots of so-called bush planes, light aircraft capable of taking off and landing at unprepared sites in the wilderness. It was a titanic job, hundreds of licenses, flight logs, and fuel receipts. The detectives were looking for those who had the technical ability to fly in the Devil's Throat area in mid-October 2014. During interviews with informants and analysis of old ranger reports, alarming information surfaced. It turned out that in 2014, a clandestine network of so-called black guides operated in the region. These were illegal guides who organized hunting for very wealthy clients who were willing to pay tens of thousands of dollars for trophies obtained in violation of the law. These people used small aircraft to quietly drop hunters into the most remote protected areas, where ordinary rangers could not reach on foot in one day. The scheme was perfect. The plane would land on a wild plateau, the client would take a shot, take the trophy's head, and within an hour they would be in the air, leaving the carcass to rot and the law far behind. Working on this version, the detectives focused on the private airfield Silver Peaks Air Park, located near the town of Haley. It was a closed community of aviators, where outsiders were not asked unnecessary questions. Of particular interest was one of the remote hangars owned by 45-year-old Brock Reynolds. His dossier fit perfectly into the psychological profile of the suspect, compiled by the analysts. Brock Reynolds was a former firefighter pilot, an elite smoke jumper, a man used to working in extreme conditions and risking his life. However, his career in public service was cut short by a scandal. Reynolds was dishonorably dismissed for systematic and gross safety violations. He was known for his arrogance and disregard for the rules. After his dismissal, Brock founded his own company, which officially organized extreme tourism tours, offering clients to experience the real adrenaline of Idaho's wilderness. Investigators obtained a warrant to inspect the administrative records of the airfield and the trash containers belonging to Reynolds' company. They were looking for any paper trail linking him to military equipment. After sorting through pounds of old invoices, bills, and customs declarations, Detective Harris finally found what he was looking for. It was a document dated the spring of 2014. According to the papers, Brock Reynolds participated in an online auction of decommissioned military property. Among the lots he purchased were 5 G-12 cargo parachutes. In the intended use column, Reynolds handwrote an explanation that now looked like a bad joke: to create scenery for a paintball club. The inspection showed that Reynolds had never opened a paintball club or even applied for a license for such a business. This was direct evidence. The parachute in which Steven Maxwell was found was not just a random piece of fabric. It was part of a batch purchased by a specific person 6 months before the murder. The circle had closed. The police now had a name, a motive related to illegal business, and a means of concealing the crime. But Harris realized that the invoices alone were not enough to convict him of murder. They needed to prove that Reynolds was in the air that fateful day, and that he returned to Earth not alone, but with a terrible burden on his conscience. The detective put down the file and looked at the map of the airfield. There had to be someone there, among the technical staff, who had seen something that was not meant for prying eyes. November of 2016 brought cold winds and leaden clouds to the Wood River Valley. The investigation, which until a month ago had relied only on circumstantial evidence and archival documents, needed live testimony. The detectives needed someone who could fill in the gaps in the chronology of events from 2 years ago, and such a witness was found. The meeting was scheduled in the city of Ketchum, in a dimly lit corner of a roadside bar called the Sawtooth Club. This place, saturated with the smell of old wood and cheap whiskey, was ideal for conversations that were not meant for prying ears. The informant turned out to be a local aircraft mechanic, a middle-aged man with rough, weathered hands, where the grease had been permanently embedded in his skin. For 2 years, he lived in fear, looking over his shoulder every day. But the news of Steven Maxwell's body found in the woods was the last straw for him. His conscience outweighed his instinct for self-preservation. The man, whose name was classified by the investigation for his safety, worked at the Silver Peaks airfield and personally serviced Brock Reynolds' planes. In particular, his old but reliable workhorse, a de Havilland Beaver. The witness, visibly nervous and constantly checking the front door of the bar, told detectives about the events of mid-October 2014. According to him, 2 days after Steven Maxwell officially stopped contacting him, Brock Reynolds returned to the airfield from an unscheduled flight. His behavior was extremely atypical. The normally confident and arrogant pilot looked pale. His movements were jerky, and his eyes showed undisguised panic. When the mechanic approached the plane for a post-flight inspection, he was struck by the first detail. The cargo winch, installed in the cabin to haul heavy equipment, was damaged. The mechanism was jammed, and the cable was stretched as if it could withstand a load that far exceeded the permissible limits. But the smell was even more disturbing. As soon as the mechanic opened the cabin door, he was hit by a pungent, chemical stench. It wasn't the smell of aviation kerosene or oil. The cabin reeked of chlorine, a chemical commonly used for disinfection, or, as forensic scientists know, to destroy biological traces. Someone had thoroughly washed the floor of the cargo compartment, trying to erase what was there. Further events unfolded even more suspiciously. Reynolds, noticing the mechanic's interest in the condition of the cabin, roughly pushed him away and pulled several black plastic garbage bags from the luggage compartment. He ordered them to be burned immediately in a barrel in the back of the hangar without asking any questions. The mechanic, following the order, noticed that one of the bags was torn. Through the hole he saw a fabric covered with brown spots. It was camouflage clothing with a distinctive pixel pattern, soaked in blood that had already begun to dry. When the mechanic froze in terror, Reynolds came up to him and quietly but clearly said that he had friends in criminal circles who knew how to deal with witnesses. This threat forced the mechanic to keep silent for 2 long years, until the body in the parachute was found. While detectives were capturing this valuable evidence, another breakthrough was taking place at the Boise Police Laboratory. Technical experts were working to recover data from Steven's handheld GPS device, which was found in a jacket pocket on his body. The device had spent 2 years in the rain, snow, and scorching sun at an altitude of 50 feet. The case was damaged, the contacts were oxidized, but the memory card, which was securely protected inside, miraculously remained intact. Cyber forensic experts managed to extract the log file of the hunter's movements for October 14, 2014. The resulting route map was a real revelation. It turned out that Steven Maxwell did not just follow the planned path. At some point, he drastically deviated from the course. The track showed that the experienced ranger had deliberately left the authorized route and went deeper into the so-called closed zone of the reserve. It was a strictly protected area where any hunting was strictly prohibited by law. The navigator data painted a clear picture of Steven's last hours of freedom. He was moving cautiously, using the terrain to camouflage himself, as if he were stalking someone or trying to remain undetected. Then the dot on the screen froze. The device recorded that Steven Maxwell spent about 40 minutes in one position. He didn't move, he just watched. The coordinates of this point pointed to a remote mountain plateau, perfectly hidden from prying eyes by rocky walls. Detective Harris, comparing the mechanic's testimony about the pilot's panic with the victim's navigator data, realized that it was time to send a team to these coordinates. What Steven saw in those 40 minutes of silence cost him his life, but now the digital memory of his device was ready to lead the police directly to the execution site. In December of 2016, when the Idaho mountain passes were already being covered with the first serious snow, an investigative team led by Detective Michael Harris received permission to conduct an expedition to a remote area of the reserve. The coordinates extracted from Steven Maxwell's navigator pointed to a spot on a high mountain plateau, safely hidden from prying eyes by a ring of sharp rocks. It was a place where no hiking trails led, and where even rangers rarely visited, due to the complexity of the terrain. The only way to get there in winter was by helicopter. The landing of the investigators and forensic experts took place in a piercing wind. The group found themselves in a deafening gorge that resembled a natural bowl. At first glance, it was just a wild piece of forest, but the experienced eyes of the experts almost immediately noticed unnatural changes in the landscape. Under the cover of stunted spruce trees, they found the remains of an old, professionally disguised camp. It was not a place for ordinary tourists to spend the night. Everything pointed to the fact that people who planned to remain unnoticed for a long time were based here. An inspection of the area yielded shocking results that confirmed the version of the black guides. In a pit covered with stones and branches, investigators found a real animal cemetery. There were skulls and bones of large mammals, grizzly bears, and ibex. Hunting these animals in this sector is a serious federal crime. The nature of the damage to the bones indicated that the animals were killed professionally, taking only trophies, heads or skins, and leaving the carcasses to rot. It was a base for poachers who served the whims of wealthy clients, willing to pay for the blood of rare species. But the main find was waiting for the detectives, a little away from the fire. One of the forensic scientists, examining tree trunks with a metal detector, received a strong signal. A fragment was stuck in the bark of an old larch tree, at the height of a person's height. When it was carefully removed, there was no doubt. It was a broken crossbow bolt shank. Later, ballistic examination confirmed the complete identity of this fragment, with the tip found in Steven Maxwell's chest. This tree became a mute witness to the last seconds of the young ranger's life. Based on the evidence collected, the investigation was able to conduct a detailed reconstruction of the events of that fateful day, October 14, 2014. Steven Maxwell, moving along his route, probably heard sounds uncharacteristic of an empty forest, or noticed glare from his equipment. Being a man of principle and responsibility, he could not pass by. He changed his course and went straight to the poacher's camp. The scenario that played out on the plateau looked like this. Steven came out of the thicket at the moment when Brock Reynolds and his client were processing a dead animal. Maxwell, realizing the gravity of the crime, probably tried to record what was happening on his camera, or openly declared his intention to inform the authorities. For Reynolds, this meant not just a fine, but the end of his business, the confiscation of his airplane, and many years in prison. He had seconds to make a decision. He did not hesitate. Reynolds raised his powerful hunting crossbow and fired. The arrow, fired at close range, pierced Steven's chest, broke his ribs, and lodged in his spine. He fell dead. But the murder was only the beginning of the horror. Reynolds found himself facing a serious problem. A human corpse was lying on the ground, and hunting season was in full swing. The forests were teeming with honest hunters and gamekeepers. Burying the body on a rocky plateau was long and unreliable. Wild animals could open the grave the very next night. And then the pilot's fevered brain came up with a devilish plan. Based on his knowledge of aerodynamics and access to specific equipment, he decided to use the sky as a grave. Reynolds loaded Steven's body into his airplane. He took out one of the old cargo parachutes he had bought at an auction. Using plastic ties, he tied the body to the slings, turning the deceased into cargo. The pilot lifted the machine into the air and headed for the Devil's Throat, a place he knew to be the most impassable and deserted. He did not plan a classic jump. Reynolds used the technique of dropping his cargo in a shaving flight. He calculated everything so that the parachute would open, but he immediately got tangled in the tall crowns of centuries-old pine trees. His calculation was cynical and cruel. The body was to hang 50 feet above the ground, out of reach of coyotes and search dogs. The wind was to dispel the smell of decomposition, and the birds were to destroy the evidence. He wanted Steven Maxwell to disappear, literally, into nothing, becoming a ghost that would never be found. Reynolds almost succeeded, but he did not take into account one small detail that Steven managed to do a moment before his death. January of 2017 covered the capital of Idaho, Boise, with a dense veil of fog and cold. As the city slept, preparing for the start of a new work week, a police SWAT team was gathering outside a private home in an upscale suburb. The operation to apprehend a suspected first-degree murderer had been planned with the utmost care. Detective Michael Harris, who had been following the trail of the Sawtooth Ridge ghost for 2 years, watched the front door from the interior of a nondescript van. He knew that the man inside was not just a poacher, but a cold-blooded killer, who considered himself above the law. At exactly 5 o'clock in the morning, the silence was broken by the sound of a battering ram smashing through the front door. A raid team burst into Brock Reynolds' home, shouting commands. The 45-year-old former firefighter pilot was taken by surprise in his bedroom. He offered no physical resistance, but as the steel handcuffs snapped around his wrists, his face showed no fear or remorse, only a cold, disdainful look, with which he looked at the armed officers as if they were annoying insects that interfered with his sleep. Immediately after the suspect was taken to the police station, a detailed search of the house began. Forensic experts methodically checked every inch of the living space, looking for evidence that could definitively link Reynolds to the death of Steven Maxwell. A built-in safe was found in the study, behind a massive painting of a mountain landscape. After the experts were able to open it, the contents of the cache shocked even experienced investigators. It was not just a treasure trove of valuables, it was an altar to Reynolds' own ego. Inside were wads of cash, fake documents under different names, and dozens of photographs. These were trophy shots that Brock had printed for his personal collection. He posed next to dead grizzlies, mountain lions, and other endangered animals. But the most important piece of evidence on the top shelf of the safe was a digital SLR camera. It did not belong to Reynolds. It was Steven Maxwell's camera. The killer kept the victim's equipment as a personal trophy, a symbol of his victory over another person. Reynolds was confident of his impunity because before he hid the camera, he formatted the memory card, deleting all the pictures. He thought he had erased history. However, he underestimated the capabilities of modern digital forensics. The Boise Police Department's cybersecurity lab worked around the clock, using advanced algorithms to recover the data, and the technology did not fail. Experts were able to recover the last images taken by Steven on that fateful day. When the images appeared on Detective Harris's monitor, the room fell dead silent. The first image clearly showed Brock Reynolds aiming a carbine at the bear, direct evidence of poaching. But the next shot was much scarier. It was blurry, taken on the move, apparently at the moment Steven realized he had been spotted. In the photo, Reynolds was turning sharply toward the lens. He was not holding a carbine, but a powerful hunting crossbow aimed directly at the camera. It was a picture of the last second of Steven Maxwell's life. The killer and the victim were looking into each other's eyes through the lens a moment before the shot was fired. The interrogation of Brock Reynolds became a psychological duel. In the interrogation room, under fluorescent lights, the suspect behaved with a defiant arrogance. He refused the lawyer, believing that he could intellectually outplay the investigators. When Harris laid out the printed recovered photographs in front of him, the mask of calmness momentarily fell from Reynolds' face, but was quickly replaced by a cynical smile. He He realized that there was no point in denying the meeting any longer. The forest belongs to those who have the power and will to take whatever they want from it, Reynolds said, looking directly into the detective's eyes. There was no pity in his voice. He started talking about Steven, not as a person, but as an unfortunate obstacle. This guy was just a tourist who made a fatal mistake. He entered the territory of a predator without having the fangs to defend himself. It's natural selection, detective, nothing personal. Under pressure from the overwhelming evidence, Reynolds began to reveal details of what happened after the shooting. His story about the disposal of the body was striking in its technical sophistication and absolute lack of empathy. He confirmed the investigators' guesses. The murder was only half the battle. The main task was to make the body disappear forever. Reynolds admitted that he used the G-12 cargo parachute deliberately. He did not plan to imitate a base jumper jump, as the press initially thought. His plan was much more cunning. He calculated that the white dome of the parachute, tangled in the crowns of tall trees, would look like garbage from below, a stuck weather probe or a piece of polyethylene that no one pays attention to. "I knew you would search on the ground," he calmly explained the mechanics of his actions. "Dogs look for the smell down there. People look at their feet. No one looks to the sky in the middle of a dense forest. I lifted him up to where only the wind and birds reigned supreme." He hoped that in a few years nature would do its job. The fabric would be destroyed by ultraviolet radiation, and the bones would be pulled apart by birds of prey, and Steven Maxwell would simply dissolve into the ecosystem, becoming part of the forest that killed him. This confession was recorded on camera. Reynolds spoke about the complex logistics of hiding the body with the same enthusiasm as a pilot discussing a successful flight. He was proud of his plan, considering it ingenious, and the only thing he seemed to regret was that an accidental surveyor's drone had ruined his perfect scheme. The arrest of Brock Reynolds put an end to the investigation, but there was still a trial to come. The community of Idaho stood in anticipation as the defendant's defense prepared a line of defense that could shock the jury even more than the murder itself. May of 2017 brought unprecedented excitement to the small town of Challis, the administrative center of Custer County. The normally quiet streets, where life goes on slowly and steadily, were filled with vans from television news channels and cars of journalists from the country's leading publications. The trial, which the press had already dubbed the Sawtooth Ridge parachutist case, was about to begin in the district court building. In the dock sat Brock Reynolds, a former pilot and organizer of extreme tours, a man whose greed and cruelty cost a young ranger his life. The trial promised to be complex and emotionally draining. Reynolds' defense team chose a predictable but aggressive strategy. The lawyers tried to convince the jury that the tragedy of October 14, 2014, was not a cold-blooded murder, but a fatal mistake, a tragic coincidence. The line of defense was based on the thesis of manslaughter. They claimed that in the thick twilight of the forest, in a state of excitement, Reynolds confused Steven Maxwell, dressed in camouflage, with a wild animal, a bear or a wapiti. The lawyers painted a portrait of a man who panicked after the fatal shot and, in a state of shock, made an irrational decision to hide the body. However, the prosecution held a trump card that could not be beaten by stories of panic. The Custer County prosecutor methodically destroyed the defense's case based on irrefutable physical evidence. The key argument was the same G-12 cargo chute. The prosecutor emphasized that a person in a state of affect can run away, try to bury the body, or cover it with branches. But a person in a state of affect does not return to the airfield, prepare the plane, pack the victim's body in a complex system of slings using industrial ties, and perform a complex technical flight to drop the cargo in a precisely calculated area. The scheme to hide the body required cold calculation, knowledge of aerodynamics, and time to prepare. It was not a panic, it was a cynical operation to eliminate evidence. A separate point of the prosecution was the recovered photos from the victim's camera, where Reynolds was aiming at the lens. This fact proved that the killer saw a person with a camera, not an animal. He shot to destroy the witness to his poaching crimes. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury, which included local residents who were well acquainted with the rules of the forest and the code of honor of hunters, did not hesitate for long. After 5 hours of deliberations, they returned to the courtroom with a verdict. The jury chairman announced the decision. Brock Reynolds was found guilty on all charges. He was charged with first-degree murder, malicious poaching, obstruction of justice, and desecration of the body of the deceased. The judge, reading the verdict, did not hide his contempt for the defendant's actions. He noted that Reynolds did not just kill a man, he tried to turn the majestic mountains into an accomplice in his crime, using wildlife as a garbage dump for his victims. The sentence was harsh and final: life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. When the last blow of the judge's gavel sounded, Brock Reynolds did not say a word. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs to a place where he would never again see the sky he loved to use for his dark deeds. A month after the verdict, when the snow in the mountains finally melted, Steven Maxwell's parents and his fiancée Sarah made their last, most difficult trip to the Sawtooth Range. They received special permission from the U.S. Forest Service to visit the site where the body was found. It was a long and silent journey. They walked the same trails that Steven had once walked, inhaling the same smell of pine needles and hearing the sound of wind in the treetops. When they reached Devil's Throat, the landscape changed a bit. The giant yellow pine that had been Steven's prison for 2 years was gone. The rangers decided to cut the tree down to the very root. This was done at the request of the family, and for safety reasons, to prevent this place from becoming a dark tourism site for fans of spooky selfies. Now there was only a wide, tar-smelling stump, with young green growth starting to make its way around it. Sarah walked up to the stump and put her hand on it. There were no more tears, only a quiet, light longing. Steven's father took out a small, heavy bronze plaque from his backpack that they had ordered in advance. With the help of the rangers, they secured it to a large granite boulder that lay next to the pine tree. There were no dates of birth or death on the plaque, only her name and the epitaph she chose. The inscription engraved on the metal read, "Steven Maxwell. He loved these mountains, and they kept him safe until the truth found its way to Earth." They stood there for a while longer, listening to the silence that no longer seemed threatening. Justice had been done, evil had been punished, and Steven had finally returned home to find peace in the family crypt, not in the cold embrace of parachute silk. As the group began the descent back into the valley, the sun began to set behind the sharp peaks of the Sawtooth Range, flooding the forest with gold and crimson light. The mountains stood still, majestic and indifferent to human passions. They saw hunters and victims, heroes and murderers. In their deep gorges and dense forests, thousands of unnamed secrets, lost travelers, and forgotten stories may still be hidden. But the secret of the parachutist hanging in the crown of a pine tree was no longer one of them. The truth, like the waters of a mountain stream, always finds its way to the surface, even if it has to fall from the sky.